Here it is, yet another war at Europe's doorstep. And when there's tension in the Middle East that's felt all the way here, why is it so hard to get the messaging right on this end? Critics of the European Commission president coming down like a ton of bricks on Ursula von der Leyen after a visit to Israel last week, where the former German defense minister left out some language on the suffering of Palestinians. She later rectified. We'll ask about a virtual EU summit that's now picked up on the language it took 9 days for the blocs to agree upon. Here, I'll read it to you, namely about Israel's right to defend itself in line with humanitarian and international law. What attitude going forward now towards Israeli hostages, many of whom are dual citizens, and the unfolding humanitarian disaster in Gaza? After Ursula von der Leyen, the German chancellor in Israel, before traveling on to Egypt, Olaf Scholz, preceding Joe Biden in Tel Aviv by 24 hours. Biden's all-in stance behind Israel, a reminder that it's also NATO allies that have their differences when it comes to the Middle East. What happens now if it escalates further? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at war on Europe's doorstep. Joining us from Strasbourg, Nathalie Loiseau, French member of the European Parliament from Emmanuel Macron's Renew bloc. Thank you for being with us.
My pleasure. Good evening.
Also joining us from Brussels, it's Christina Kausch, Deputy Managing Director at the German Marshall Fund think tank. Welcome to the show.
Good evening.
Ulrike Franke, Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, joins us from the French capital. How are you?
Thanks, I'm very well. Thanks for having me.
And France 24 correspondent Dave Keating is our man in Brussels. How are things?
Very good, Francois.
You can join the conversation, by the way, on the hashtag F24debate. Now, there's no obvious link between the events unfolding in the Middle East and the 45-year-old Tunisian national who shot dead 2 Swedish football fans with an assault rifle in Brussels on Monday. He described himself as a member of ISIS, same as the 20-year-old arrested in last Friday's fatal stabbing of a high school teacher in northern France. With the return of terror attacks to Belgium and France, right when everyone is on edge over the Middle East. Dave Keating, when you know that alerts have been raised in places like Italy and Spain, first off, what can you tell us about the mood where you are?
Well, there's some sense of relief because Brussels did just lower the terror threat because the person who perpetrated that terrorist attack last night, leaving those 2 visiting Swedish people dead, has been killed this morning in a firefight with police. So there's a bit of sense of relief about that, because when this first happened last night, the first thing people remembered, of course, was the Brussels attacks in 2016. That was a cell of terrorists, and one attack was followed by another attack. So everyone was very on edge to see, was this a lone wolf or was this a group? The Belgian authorities now say they are pretty certain this was just a lone wolf. So people's tension level is going down today. The threat level is going down, back down to 3, down from the highest level that it was raised to 4 today. I will say, since 2015, 2016, people in Brussels have lived with a reality that this type of thing does happen. But there's still tension in the air. And of course, when this happened last night, the first thing people thought was that it was probably related to the Israel-Palestine conflict. And in a way, that tension in the air in all European capitals has been felt. As it turns out, it looks like there may not have been a link between what's happening in Israel and this terror attack in Brussels, at least not a strong link. The authorities say it was actually driven by people in Sweden burning the Quran, that rolling issue over the past couple of months, and that this attacker actually deliberately targeted Swedish people because that's what he was upset about.
Ulrike Franke, when the news came in of that Hamas attack on October 7th, lots of people in the French capital hark back to the Bataclan, what happened there, because a music festival was targeted. And this feeling of anxiety, your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I think you're right. There are kind of eerie parallels. And of course, all over Europe and the Western world, countries are concerned about the danger of terrorist attacks. And by the way, I think this is a really important aspect, because I think it also reminds us that European countries' stance on the Israeli-Hamas war that we're going to see now also depend to some extent on kind of domestic considerations. And France, for example, as listeners may know, is home to the largest Muslim community in Europe and the second largest Jewish community outside of Israel in the world. And so, of course, for France, its own stance on the Hamas-Israel war will also be colored by, domestic considerations and a fear of kind of having these fights play out on French soil. And of course, France isn't the only country where this plays a role. Every European country has its own domestic consideration, its own historical links to the region, and all of this plays and influences how the countries position themselves also at the European level.
So when France and Germany, for instance, ban pro-Palestinian demonstrations, but the UK allows them, is that because of, like you say, those domestic considerations?
Yeah, I think it is a mix. So for Germany, for example, what plays, of course, an enormous role in this conflict is the Holocaust. And the fact that, it has been said for years and decades that the security of the Israeli state is part of the raison d'etat, kind of the main national interest of Germany. Like, this is something that Angela Merkel said in 2008, and it has been repeated ever since. And so, of course, Germany's stance in this war is influenced by these historical historical issues, domestic issues, all of that. I mean, I think this is always true to some extent when it comes to foreign policy, and it's always true when Europeans are trying to find a common foreign policy, but especially in this conflict, which is, such a long conflict. It obviously didn't start just with Hamas's terrible terror attacks against Israel. So every European country has their own kind of links to the regions, and they can be very difficult. And that also influences how they deal with Israel and how they deal with the situation inside their countries, such as forbidding or not forbidding demonstrations of Palestinians or Israelis or anything like that.
Nathalie Loiseau, how do you explain it that the French banned those pro-Palestinian demonstrations and the British did not?
Well, I don't want to comment on what the Brits do, but it's quite obvious that we see within demonstrations pro-Hamas slogans and people who try to mix support for the right of Palestinians to have a state and support for a terrorist group. This is not acceptable. What has happened in Israel is not resistance, it's not an armed group fighting military, it's a slaughter. It's the worst bloodshed of Jewish people since the Holocaust. People were killed just because they were Jews, as well as terrorists who strike in our streets have killed a French teacher just because he's a teacher, or yesterday in Brussels, Swedish supporters just because they were Swedes. This is purely unacceptable, and you cannot pretend to support the Palestinian right to have a state and mix it with the support for terrorism.
The fact now that, as the panel's been saying, where it's going to get worse before it gets better right now in Israel and in the occupied territories. The death toll is up to 3,000 in Gaza. Is that just going to create more radicalized young men?
Well, obviously, Hamas has no interest in peace with Israel. Hamas has always advocated for the destruction of Israel, and they have done whatever they could to avoid any sort of peace process. There are very few people on both sides really committed to peace, and Hamas is the last of them. So yes, peace prospect is unfortunately far away, further than ever, and Palestinian people are hostages of Hamas. Hamas does not support them. Hamas exposes them to violence. They use them as human shields. They prevent people from leaving Gaza City, and they have a heavy responsibility toward Palestinian people.
Christina Kausch, the Middle East is your remit at the German Marshall Fund. What can you tell us about how radicalized or polarized public opinion is becoming here in Europe when they watch events over in the Middle East?
Well, I think we've all seen on the news images, anecdotal evidence of statements made by EU residents with Palestinian origin or other Arab origin, making commentaries that are unacceptable for somebody who lives in a democratic state. However, this is anecdotal evidence. I wouldn't venture to draw any conclusions from that on a large-scale radicalization of Palestinians or Arabs in Europe in general. I think we are living in a very heated and emotional situation these days, and rightfully so, given the scale of the attack and given what we are seeing now in Belgium and elsewhere. As we said earlier, the gun attack in Brussels, for example, was not directly linked to what happened in Israel. However, I would say there was an indirect link, which is, of course, in a situation like this, many extremist groups of other leanings seize the moment and the international attention for attacks they have planned, for actions they have planned, that somehow they feel that may attract attention in the Arab world, in the United States, in Europe at this particular moment.
And so hence the importance of getting the messaging correct when it comes to the European Union. And it's been a bit of a rocky road since October the 7th for the EU. Last week, it was the European Commission having to retract a hasty claim of the suspension of aid to the Palestinian territories. Then came last Friday's visit by the Commission President and Parliament President to Israel. There, Ursula von der Leyen raising hackles back on the continent with these remarks.
That we have to care for the Palestinian people and humanitarian needs. But the most important is that the world is very clear that it is Israel that has to be defended and Israel that has to be respected and protected, and this is the reason why we're here to show this.
Now, she's since qualified those remarks, and on Sunday, the EU27 agreed to common language. Some, however, are still fuming.
I very much agree with those who have criticised the statement by the President of the Commission, which I'm sure is what you're referring to, but equally in the same way as I was very heavily critical of the so-called agreement with Tunisia in relation to migration, and I don't think it was helpful. I may not have been meant to have malevolent consequences, but it's certainly we need a better performance in relation to European Union diplomacy and practice.
Now, Michael Higgins is a largely ceremonial post to Dave Keating, but he's not alone. Is this just a storm in a teacup, or does Ursula von der Leyen have a big problem after the fact that she's been seen as being too much on the side of Israel and not enough on the side of Palestinian civilians?
Yeah, it's definitely not a storm in a teacup. This is a real problem for President von der Leyen. And what you heard there from President Higgins, I mean, he's very free to speak publicly. That's the nature of the Irish president's role. Prime ministers and presidents have been more cautious in their concern or their even anger over Ursula von der Leyen's stances over the past week. Now, right now, as we speak, the 27 prime ministers and presidents of the EU are in a video meeting to try to agree some common stance. They came out with that written statement on Sunday. I think they want to go further tonight to try to counter this idea over the past week that the EU has not only been chaotic and split in its response, but also feckless, that it hasn't really stood out from the US stance, for instance, that it, even though historically has had a kind of trusted broker role in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, many were complaining that Ursula von der Leyen squandered that over the past week.
But wait, just hold on a second here, Dave. How does it work when you have a major crisis like this? What do? Do they get together and decide together on the messaging? How's it supposed to work?
Well, exactly. This is the problem with people complaining about President von der Leyen, because what exactly was she supposed to do? Wait until there was a meeting several days after the Israeli attack to say anything? I think the same people who are criticizing her right now are also people who say they want a strong EU voice in the world and who who would actually probably praise von der Leyen if she said something they agreed with. So I think there is a bit of hypocrisy going on here that, you know, on one hand, you want an EU to be able to speak strongly, but then when the EU president does speak strongly, people don't like it. That being said, it is true that foreign policy is not, strictly speaking, an EU competence, and it's certainly not within the competence of the Commission president. I think there's no doubt here that she has pushed the envelope here a bit in terms of what her role is supposed to be, but you know, others would say, well, that envelope needs to be pushed a bit, and if we want a strong sovereign EU in the world, then the person who has been selected to be the EU's voice in the world needs to be given some freedom and some leeway to decide how they're going to react quickly at a time like this.
Nathalie Loiseau?
Well, it's quite obvious that the President of the Commission is not in charge of the foreign policy of the European Union. This is the Council and this is the High Representative Vice President who are in charge. So Ursula von der Leyen made a blunder, and it's not the first one. When she went to Azerbaijan and qualified and called Ilham Aliyev a reliable partner after the war of 2020 and just before an ethnic cleansing in Nagorno-Karabakh, it was already a first blunder, and we were quite a number of people reacting and asking ourselves, why on earth is she intruding in foreign policy and not defending a European Union approach? The same goes with Israel. Showing support to Israeli people was what the President of the European Parliament was doing, because she was invited by the Knesset. And for me, that was perfect. And what she said was also agreed by a vast majority of members of the European Parliament. But having Mrs. von der Leyen, who's not in charge, first of all, not criticizing her Commissioner Vaheli, who decided to suspend European financial assistance to Palestinians where he has no competence to do so, then going to Israel and not even mentioning international humanitarian law, it creates confusion, it puts us in a bad position. This is exactly what we didn't want to have. Yes, we want a strong European voice, but from someone who has the authority to do it and who is competent.
Yeah, that Commissioner, Oliver Vaheli, you're one of the signatories of a call for him to be ousted. Each EU nation has one commissioner. He's the commissioner for Hungary. Each with their own portfolio, but there's 27 commissioners because there's 27 nations in the EU. And you've asked that he be ousted. He had made those remarks on the Monday after the Hamas attack. They were retracted several hours later. You're saying he doesn't harbor the blame alone.
Well, it's not the first time that we have a problem with Commissioner Vaheli. When he goes to Bosnia-Herzegovina, and we know how sensitive this country is and how many issues there are, we've seen him siding up with the head of the Republika Srpska and at one of the worst moments. When he talks to Ukraine, we don't know whether he is the commissioner in charge of enlargement or just a representative of Viktor Orban. He always insists on the fate of Hungarian minorities in Ukraine, which is, to my view, not a real priority, only for Budapest. So the European Union foreign policy is not in the hands of Hungary and not in the hands of Viktor Orban. And unfortunately, Mr. Vaheli, who used to be an ambassador of the Prime Minister Orban, doesn't seem to have understood that his role has changed.
Ulrike Franke, some are criticizing Ursula von der Leyen for going in the first place, saying this was her own initiative for going to Israel last Friday.
Yeah, so I can't comment on whether it was her initiative or whether, who invited her and how. I'm not privy to these debates, but I must say I find it a little bit problematic to now say that von der Leyen doesn't have the competency or the legitimacy to, go on such a trip and make pronouncements. Of course, one can very well criticize what she said, but the fact that she went and that she said something, I mean, for me, that is part of the geopolitical commission, which is something that she had announced years ago. And a lot of people, I almost want to say most people, have actually welcomed. And incidentally, I mean, Nathalie Loiseau, whose analysis I massively appreciate, but if I remember correctly, you were quite positive towards the geopolitical commission and von der Leyen's position when it came to Ukraine and the Ukraine aid. Now, again, I think it is absolutely legitimate to criticize what von der Leyen said, how she said it, the stance she took, all of it. But just the fact that she did go and she took a stand, criticizing that is, I think, a bit problematic, given that a lot of people have been advocating for a geopolitical commission, and she's kind of following through with this. So in a way, what this conflict really shows is that there is a kind of fight over competencies and over who has the say on foreign policy within the EU. Is it Charles Michel? Is it Borrell, the high representative on foreign policy? Is it von der Leyen? I would argue in a way they all have a little bit to say. And what is problematic is when they don't say the same thing. And this is what we had over the last few days.
So, Christina Kausch, how do you get them to say the same thing?
Yeah, we are focusing on the reactions of the EU of the last few days. Yeah, the way the EU has reacted or not, and who within the EU to the Hamas attack is only the culmination of 10 years or more of absolutely stalled EU policy on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The EU Foreign Affairs Council has not agreed or barely agreed on any statement in the last 10 years. I think there was only one, the last 10 years on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at all, which meant that the EU stick with a basically outdated, lowest common denominator position, which is the only thing the 27 then agree on. And as was mentioned earlier, this is not only due to the divisions among EU member states in terms of what should be done. It also has to do with internal EU divisions. For example, Hungary has blocked a number of EU positions, common positions on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the last years, some of which were blocked because of substance reasons and others for political reasons that had nothing to do with this dossier and perhaps with other divisions within the EU and other dossiers. So I think this is really important to underline that EU has been a non-actor on this dossier over 10 years at least. And when Ursula von der Leyen goes there and acts on her own, or when a commissioner, even though it's very objectionable what he did, was a big foreign policy blunder to just tweet to suspend aid, which would have been absolutely counterproductive. So, but when central people in the EU institutions go rogue in this way, if you let me call it like that, that is also an expression of the absolutely stalled EU policy on this dossier, because they know there is no way that will be going back in such an urgent situation to the 27 to get a common statement.
Okay, there's two ways of looking at it. You're right on what you say about outliers who can hold up the process, Christina Kausch. But then you have the big players. And one of the big players is Germany, of course, the largest economy in the European Union. Its chancellor in Israel this Tuesday before going on to Egypt. Is he there waving a bit the EU flag, or is he just there for Germany?
I wouldn't be in a position to say whose flags he waves, but I think it's mainly there for Germany in the first place, showing, as Ulrike was already alluding to, Germany's special historic responsibility. It's a no-brainer for a German chancellor to go there directly if something like this happens to Israel. If this looks also good on the EU, great, but I wouldn't mistake that or what he says as an EU position, because I don't think there is currently an EU position on the Israel-Palestinian conflict.
Yeah, and Olaf Scholz there, who is in the Middle East one day before the U.S. President Joe Biden goes in. Dave Keating, you cover both the European Union and NATO, and you have the Americans who are clearly going all in behind Israel. Does that drag in NATO allies?
I think it's difficult to say because it's not quite the same thing as with Ukraine, for instance. So obviously NATO's mission originally was to counter Soviet aggression, and as it continues to exist, it's to counter Russian aggression, and that's directly related to the Ukrainian conflict. NATO's mission, at least its founding mission, its raison d'etre, is not the Middle East, and I think there are divisions within NATO about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that mirror the divisions within the European Union. At the same time, NATO is pretty preoccupied with the Ukraine war, so I wouldn't see any compelling reason for NATO to get at all involved in this conflict, even in a debate type way. And we can also see that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict happening right now is distracting from the Ukraine conflict. That was clearly President Vladimir Zelensky's concern when he made that last-minute unannounced trip here to Brussels to visit NATO last week to try to keep Ukraine on the agenda, in the headlines. Didn't seem to work, actually. But I think NATO, even if there are divisions within NATO on this subject, it's not as big of a problem for NATO as it is for the European Union, who does need to make these decisions about aid, about what stance to take, and about what kind of pressure to put on the Israeli government in terms of complying with international law.
Nathalie Loiseau, let's talk about public opinion on this, because when it comes to Ukraine, the EU and the United States has been pretty much in lockstep, supporting Kyiv against Vladimir Putin's Russia's invasion. When it comes to the Middle East, will public opinion spot the difference between the European position and the American position?
I'm not so sure that there is such a difference, because support for Israeli people who have suffered a terrible bloodshed is widespread in the European Union as it is in the United States. Efforts to try to contain the conflict and avoid spillover to the region have to be coordinated, but I'm certain that Joe Biden, as well as Olaf Scholz, Emmanuel Macron, and others, are trying their best to make sure that there is not a second front, for instance, in southern Lebanon against Israel. And I do believe that we are all in agreement that international humanitarian law has to be respected, and that there's a need for humanitarian assistance for civilians in Gaza. So there are a lot of bases for agreement between Europeans and Americans. And indeed, it's not a NATO issue, not at all, especially because Turkey and NATO has quite a different stance, and we've seen and heard statements made in Ankara, which are very different from the ones you hear in the European Union. And it's not unusual to have differences with Turkey. So I think we can coordinate our efforts. We must coordinate our efforts, talking to countries in the region, talking to Israeli authorities, so that they also feel some sort of pressure not to do something so harmful that peace would be impossible in the future. We know that we have a government in Israel headed by Benjamin Netanyahu, which has never been eager to work towards peace. We also know that for years, the United States had turned its back from the Middle East peace process, as well as the European Union had paid little attention. Usually when you don't care about the Middle East cares about you.
Yeah, and certainly what Europeans can argue, and you heard earlier Ulrika Franke discussing how it feels personal for so many on this continent when when it blows up in the Middle East, is the fact that it is, of course, geographically closer. The European Council President, Charles Michel, insisting in an interview with the Associated Press that most people are indeed on the same page. Here's what he had to say.
If there would be more difficulties at the regional level, we would have immediately huge difficulties on the European soil because of the refugees, point one, and we know how it can be used by some political groups within the EU to fuel some controversies and to make the EU more fragmented, but for another reason, because we know that in our societies across the EU, there are also different feelings, emotions among our citizens, and it's very important not to import within the EU the tragic conflicts at the external level.
Ulrike Franke, your reaction listening there to the European Council President?
Well, my reaction is that to some extent, this isn't really anymore about importing this conflict, because I think to some extent it is already here. I mean, as I was alluding to earlier, we have these communities from these countries or who feel close to this conflict for religious reasons or other reasons. They are already in Europe. They are part of the European society. So I think, there's a reason why we have these strong debates all over Europe, because this really does concern us immediately. And as I was also saying, we have these historical links to the regions. I mean, long going far back, colonial times, and then, of course, again, the Holocaust and all of this. So this is a conflict that many, and if not most, Europeans have an opinion on, and this makes it so hard, to have these discussions. And of course, given how tragic the everything has been since October the 7th, at least. This is a very hard decision. This is a very hard discussion to be had in Europe, both at the political level and at the societal level, and by the way, in the media as well.
Yeah, Christina Kausch, when you hear Charles Michel there talking about the huge difficulties on the European soil because of refugees, your thoughts?
Well, if you remember the so-called refugee crisis that was triggered by in Europe, that was triggered by the Syria war, that led to a lot of problems within the European Union, political problems, political pressures, and of course, Mr. Michel and other European political leaders are afraid for a repeat of that. So, which is why they've already been engaging in shuttle diplomacy with Egypt and Jordan, other countries, to help host a potential influx of Palestinian refugees and strike a similar deal to the one that was struck with Tunisia in order to prevent refugees from coming to European soil.
And it's again imported, and it's also felt. It's also heartfelt for many. Nathalie Loiseau, we had this press conference of the family of this 21-year-old who'd attended a concert and was abducted by Hamas at a press conference that took place in Tel Aviv a short while ago. Her name is Mia Shem. Her story is a reminder that it's also citizens of Spain, Germany, Austria, Romania, Portugal, and more who are missing. And we're headed towards what could be some kind of total war in the Gaza Strip right now.
Yes, indeed. There are people who were killed, dual national French Israelis. There are approximately 300,000 French people living in Israel. So we have dead people, we have people who have been abducted. So it's something that really strikes very strongly in France as well. There is a sense of responsibility for whoever talks about the conflicts, knowing that hostages are being held and that probably some third countries are trying to mediate to have them freed.
We're getting news as we speak of at least, this is according to the Palestinian Health Ministry, at least 200 killed in an airstrike on a hospital in Gaza. And again, Nathalie Loiseau, it's only the beginning.
It might be only the beginning. Let's be clear. Israel has a right to defend itself after what happened. Let's remember then when we were struck by terrorist attacks in Paris, Charlie Hebdo, the Bataclan, we went against Daesh in Syria, and we're still in a coalition to fight Daesh in Syria. But we all know that Hamas is keeping civilians as human shields. We all know that the Gaza Strip is heavily populated. And it's extremely difficult for Israel to take the right decision. There is going to be violence. There is going to be emotion, and rightly so, because seeing civilians, Palestinian children being killed will only trigger more rage, more anger, and postpone peace for years or decades. There is no good solution right now, and obviously there is not much that the European Union can do except trying to restrict the conflict and avoid that Lebanon, Syria, and others get involved, because it could only get worse.
Yeah, and for that again, and that brings us back to what Christina Kausch was saying earlier, you have to speak in unison. It'll be interesting to see, as Dave was saying earlier, what comes out of that virtual summit or meeting that took place earlier. We talked about the German Chancellor traveling to Israel and to Egypt. France's president says he's got a bag ready to go to the Middle East, but he doesn't give a firm date yet. He says he wants a concrete agreement on humanitarian issues and more broadly, as he put it, quote, on everything.
This extremely difficult moment for the Israeli people, for Palestinian civilians, and for the whole region shows that those who may have believed that the issue was basically only economic and security related now realize that it is also political, and that it cannot be resolved without ambitiously re-engaging in a peace process. This is what we're working on, and it is on this basis that I will be visiting the region.
Ulrike Franke, your thoughts. You talked about Olaf Scholz earlier, perhaps going on behalf of Germany, not the EU. Is Emmanuel Macron speaking on behalf of France, not the EU either?
Well, I think heads of government, national heads of government in Europe, first and foremost, always speak for their own states. And I think that's perfectly fine. I mean, you know, ideally, they certainly shouldn't take positions that are, you know, somehow against what the EU as a whole takes. But given that EU positioning usually, unless we have someone like von der Leyen being more outspoken, but usually EU positions are, of course, a compromise between the 27. And so by definition, a bit more watered down, possibly in one direction or the other, than the positions that national heads of government can take.
But you had,
so
excuse me, but Ulrike,
yeah.
you had last week that sort of, I don't know, this therapy session, if you will, between the French president and the German chancellor, Emmanuel Macron going to Hamburg. There was the images of him eating the pickled herring sandwich and all of that. Wouldn't it have been better if the pair had gone together?
Possibly. I mean, I'm always someone, you know, who's advocating for Franco-German cooperation on everything. I mean, this meeting in Hamburg, let's be clear, this was about kind of internal Franco-German issues, such as, you know, on the energy policy of the EU and on defense and things like that, not so much on kind of EU foreign policy. But yeah, sure. I mean, ideally, France and Germany and really all the other European Union heads of government should be working together. But I don't personally think it is an issue if national heads of government kind of go as, you know, as it is their role and communicate their own country's position, as long as it isn't, you know, completely opposed to what the EU is saying. And I don't think neither what Scholz said in Israel nor what Macron may be saying in the future visit is going to be, you know, completely different than the position that now the EU has agreed upon.
So, Christina Kausch, what is the EU's role?
In the clip that was just shown of Macron, he suggested something that I think is quite important. We are all focused now on, and so are the policymakers internationally, on reactions to what happened. But with all those reactions and shows of solidarity and symbolic statements, we mustn't forget, and humanitarian aid also, and security aid in the case of the United States, we mustn't forget that this all came from somewhere. This is not something that popped up. And the confrontations between Israel and the Palestinians, and in this particular case, Israel and Hamas, has been flaring up in cycles over the last decade and a half, and has always been flaring up. And there's been some mediation, and there's been some blockade, and again mediation, and then it's been clamped down, and then some time of calm, and then it all starts over again. This time it's qualitatively different. It's much greater scale, and this is really the big bang. I think that has kind of, or that one would hope has exploded the inertia, both in European cycles, in Palestinian policy cycles, the moderate ones in among the Israeli public, and in the United States, and across the Arab world, that ignoring the larger Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not, and the Palestinian question is not going to be sustainable, and that the level of violence is going to get worse and worse, and that it is not possible to sideline this, as has been attempted by successive U.S. administrations over the last few years. This is not working. There has to be a solution, and I understand what Macron was saying.
And who's the most effective broker? Who's the most effective broker? Is it one of the European leaders? Is it the EU? Is it Joe Biden?
Well, to be a broker, you need to have leverage and you need to be credible. I think that, first of all, the only ones with real leverage are the United States, at least, to be able to put pressure on Israel. So, and then there is people that need to have access to Hamas. The EU, for example, doesn't qualify as a broker because of that, because it has a no-contact policy, self-imposed with Hamas, and cannot get in touch. So I think there are several countries that have offered themselves as mediators, among them Turkey, Qatar, Egypt, almost all the countries in the region, Saudi Arabia, which has seen a slight rapprochement with Israel over the U.S., with the help of the U.S. over the last couple of years. So there are different options, but I don't think we are at that stage yet. Right now, it's about crisis management, and once there can be some sort of ceasefire, then we need to think hard about how the status quo can be broken on the Palestinian question, and how to get to a two-state solution or any other solution that both sides might accept.
Yeah, the Middle East crisis certainly dominating all. It's pushed out of the headlines. EU enlargement talks, Europe's support for Ukraine as winter approaches, Nagorno-Karabakh, with the Armenian president who addressed the European Parliament, where Nathalie Loiseau is earlier, and Dave Keating. We haven't even talked about Poland's elections and what that means for the bloc. All this is forgotten.